So welcome along everyone to yet another episode of In Conservation with, I am David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder, and today I have a very special guest by the name of Professor Kate Jones. As soon as I get to know more, I'll drop the professor bit because I'm quite informal, probably after about 2 minutes. Kate, or Professor Kate actually, how are you?
That's a complicated question in lockdown, isn't it? I don't want to commit to that. Fine.
Talking about lockdown, how has the experience been for you?
Well, at the beginning, I thought, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to learn to knit. I'm going to watch all those films and read all those books. And I've done absolutely zero of those things. But I have done quite a lot of other things, which is support my students and, write some stuff. So I've done something, but not as much as I thought it was going to do.
Okay, well that's better than some people actually, I can tell you. I met Kate.
Hold on, I wrote a paragraph of my book.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. That's it though.
The beginning paragraph or just a random paragraph?
No, like the beginning, the opening part of the book.
Okay.
So it was like, it took me about 2 weeks and it was about 300 words long. So at that rate, may never write one. Yeah,
but the thing is, it's a start, isn't it? I mean, it's a perfect fit to start, the beginning, the first paragraph. But anyway, listen, I met you, Kate, oh God, 4 years ago?
Yeah, I can't remember where we met.
I'll tell you, we were given a talk. We were on the stage together for London Wildlife Trust meeting. It was me, you. It's like a bit of a conference. We were sitting down having a chat, and we were asked questions from the floor. And I remember being with you and thinking, "Wow, you're amazing in terms of your knowledge as well as your gags." And I thought I got to have you on this. And you know what, people, Zoomers, it's taken a long time to get Kate here. You know, we had to really tempt her in a big way. In a massive way. I mean, she's probably the most difficult guest to get on here. So I'm really happy that she's here. And I just hope she stays the whole time because she might decide to walk out after 20 minutes. Well, just to tell you who Kate is, just in case you're wondering, she's a professor of ecology and biodiversity at the University College of London and the director of the Nature Smart Centre in the Institute of Future Living, which sounds really kind of futuristic. What is the Institute of Future Living? For those uneducated like me.
Well, I have to confess, it doesn't actually exist yet, but we're building it. So it's a new campus in the Olympic Park that UCL is building, and it's got a focus on good science and all that other good stuff, but also community engagement and local schools and making university more accessible to everybody. So it's kind of tackling some big global issues, but also some local contextual issues too.
Yeah, if I had my time again, I'd definitely try and go to university. I went to the University of Life on the Street, which I'm still attending now, but it sounds great, the future. It's a great title actually for the Institute because obviously it's not existing yet. She held appointments.
It doesn't exist. Actually, there's some kind of hoardings. There's a hoardings. Apparently it's going to go up in 22, but let's see.
Okay. You held appointments at the University of Cambridge, Columbia University, Imperial College London, and has an honorary fellow at the Zoological Society of London. Your research investigates the interface of ecological and human health using statistical and mathematical modelling to understand the impact of global land use and climate change on ecological and human systems, with a particular focus on emerging infectious diseases.
It basically means I look at how the world is changing and I try to understand, not just from like a community perspective of how many species are going extinct, but what does that mean for our health and well-being? And I do that because that's the only kind of thing that the policymakers are really interested in. So how does losing biodiversity and wildlife affect our health and well-being?
Yeah, well, I'm
trying to talk in the language of the policymakers and the people with loads of money. So what is a bird worth? You know, how does it help me? Because
no, it's such a shame it boils down to that. It boils down to the dollar bill at the end of the day, which is really...
you know, if you can make those arguments, you've won the day.
Yeah, you've got to talk their language, I suppose. Your research also develops applied artificial intelligence tools for monitoring ecological health, particularly for monitoring ecosystems acoustically, and runs a number of wildlife citizen science programs. You've written over 100 articles and book chapters, and you started a paragraph as well. And in previous journals such as Nature and Science and is a scientific advisor for a number of international biodiversity charities, and chaired the Bat Conservation Trust for 9 years. And in 2008, you won the Louverhoom Prize for outstanding contributions to zoology. And I think just reading that's an outstanding contribution straight away.
You missed something out though. I'm Charles Darwin's 8th cousin, 6 times removed.
Right, that's it. That's the other thing I thought about. You know, what was he like?
Well, you know, you know, to be honest, everyone on this call will be Charles Darwin's 8th cousin, 6 times removed, to be honest, because it's so distant that anyone can be. I think anyone maybe alive today might be his 8th.
Evolution, isn't it, really?
It was just that I joined Ancestry.com, and I somehow have got some kind of distant Lord blah, blah, blah ancestor. And I managed to click on him, and then you open up a whole new world of people that have looked at genealogy. And someone emailed, some like random stalky, you know, cousin that I didn't know I had, you know, before, emailed me to say, oh, I see that you're at UCL. I was like, oh my God, that's really scary. Wow. And then he said, did you know that Charles Darwin is your 8th cousin, 6 times removed? I was like, okay, you're crazy. So that's how I know.
That is really kind of, well, interesting, I suppose, more than...
Well, Charles Darwin had a house where my office is. There's a blue plaque and everything.
So you were drawn to him anyway, naturally?
Naturally drawn to him. And then I realised that he was my cousin.
That's amazing. Well, we need to see you in a different light, Zoomers. Definitely. Before I carry on, I must say, but this whole evening has been sponsored by Leica Nature and Birding, and also King's Place Music Foundation, and they have a year which they dedicate to nature called Nature Unwrapped, and they're actually sponsoring the whole of this year. And I'm also leading a walk and for King's Place, and unfortunately I haven't got my notebook here, but my good friend Claire is going to put it up in the chat, and she'll tell you where it is. The Walk with the Urban Birder. Thank you. So, Kate, we're here to talk about, well, COVID-19 and bats, but let's just have a chat about bats first. How did you first kind of get into them, if for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, I kind of, when I was growing up, my brother took me, my mother died when I was 18 months old, and I was raised by a motley crew of neighbours and my father and loads of brothers. So I had a kind of quite weird upbringing, and I got taken when I was about 11 to see Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I fell in love with Harrison Ford because he's amazingly beautiful.
It does look like a bat, doesn't he?
So, anyway, I wanted to be Harrison Ford. I wanted to be Indiana Jones and go on adventures. But I also liked listening to all the, programs by David Attenborough. So I wanted to be a kind of love child of David Attenborough and Harrison Ford, and go out into the world and find out things, have adventures. And so I went to Leeds University to do a zoology degree. So my father wanted me to be, he was like, zoology, what's that? I want you to be a doctor. I was like, I don't want to be a doctor. I want to be a zoologist. So he was, totally not happy. But then I met someone at university who was a professor of zoology, and he was really into bats. And so he introduced me to a tiny colony of bats in North Yorkshire moors, and he was checking the bat boxes, and he went up and he came down with a whole load of bats in his hand, and he put one on my hand, and it just sat there, and he was like, "What do you want?" And it was just so hard ass that I just thought that was the most brilliant thing ever. And I completely fell in love with bats, and they're just so awesome and so weird and so kick ass. So that's it. I was hooked.
The thing is with bats, though, funny enough, I was giving a talk just before this. I've mentioned earlier, I was talking with at a Green Party conference, and before we actually started, someone got on the subject of bats because I was saying I was chatting to you, and she was saying, "Yeah, I've got bats in my garden, and I just wonder what kind of bats they are because I see them flying around." Why are bats so hard to tell just watching flying around?
Well, because they don't rely on eyesight so much as we do. Because they have to hunt at night. So hunting at night in 3 dimensions after tiny insects is really hard. So, you know, they do have good eyesight. They're not blind as a bat, that's a complete myth. But they have this really sophisticated echolocation system. So they see with sound. So they don't see the world, they don't differentiate the world with vision as much as we do. So when we're looking at bats, we're looking at them with our eyes, and actually we should just be listening to them because they're making, different calls and different social calls and different feeding buzzes, which tells you what they're doing. It also tells you what species they are because they hunt in different ways. So we're not looking at them right. So they may look very similar and hard to tell apart if you're just looking, but if you're listening, you can tell them apart.
I mean, that's interesting because obviously I've gone bat detecting, so maybe we can talk about it later, but I've done that, and it's been really exciting hearing the different sort of clicks and tones, the pipistrelle, the difference between the common pipistrelle and the, soprano, yeah. But in Spain, I'm actually still kind of coming out of lockdown in southwest Spain, and we have bats that fly around during the day sometimes, and also even in the winter, because the winter's not that cold. And I've kind of worked out that one of them could be a free-tailed, F-R-E-E-tailed bat, because someone told me once, and it kind of looks like it's got a bit of a tail on it. But then I've seen at least 3 different types of bat, including one with big ears, which could have been some kind of horseshoe bat or long-eared bat or something. And I've been hearing legends about this massive bat, which is quite rare, and it attacks migrating birds and eats them. And I was thinking, I want to meet that bat. Does it exist?
Yes, it does. It's called the greater nocturnal bat, and it's been recorded attacking birds on the wing as they migrate. So I don't think that's a normal diet, but they have been recorded attacking birds. So I think it's pretty cool.
It's like a legend.
For bats and birds, I think bats won there.
Yeah, it's like a legend here. People talk about it. So does that bat rely on echolocation, or does it? Is it more? Does it just attack? Does it attack birds as they migrate at night?
Yeah, I don't think we know too much about this bat as yet, but it would it needs echolocation to find its way around. So the only bats which don't echolocate are fruit bats. So old world fruit bats, which are these Pteropidae. They live in this big family, Pteropidae. They've got like dog-like faces. I'm sure you guys have seen them already, but they don't tend to echolocate at all. Or some of them do click if they live in a cave. But most bats, so that's the majority of the 1,400 species, use echolocation to find their way around. So all these bats need to be able to see in the dark and also find and communicate. So they all use this echolocation to find their way around.
And in the UK, how many species are there?
There are about 17 species, maybe 18. One might be resident rather than just a transient visitor. So we're not sure yet. But 17 species. But in the highest species richness in Europe is in Bulgaria and in Romania, so about 44 there. So I think there's about 35 in Spain.
Wow. So by their very nature, the nocturnal nature, and the fact you don't hear them unless you've got special equipment, makes them quite difficult to study, I'd imagine.
Yeah, but absolutely fascinating though. You know, they're kind of secret animals. That's what drew me to them in the first place, because you know, they're just so mysterious and cool. You know, I think, what's not to like? They're just so weird.
When you say what's not to like and use the word weird in the same sentence, which makes me think, why do people not like them? Why are people afraid of them? I mean, I remember when I was a kid, my dad, when a moth flew into the house, he would say, "Kill that bat." I said, "Dad, it's a moth."
I think in some cultures, like in Chinese culture, bats are thought as good luck, actually. And there are many cultures where bats are good luck. But I think in the Western culture, we kind of got sidetracked by some, you know, medieval imagery of Christianity, which had got kind of a Satan as bats with bats' wings. So I think it got it got kind of an early stage got associated with Satan, which is not good. And then like Bram Stoker, you know, that got written, and that was about Dracula, you know, and bats. So I think it got associated with that, and that was because the author heard that a report that people have been finding, you know, vampire bats in South America, and so then linked those two things, and then you got Bram Stoker being written. So that was quite unfortunate. And also they're kind of mysterious, and they're at night and you can't really see them. So I guess they've got this kind of reputation. But you've also got Batman. Batman's good.
Well,
so
Leica's a bit dark.
But Batman's a goodie, you know.
He's still a bit dark, isn't he?
He is quite dark. And I think for a lot of people that love bats, that's kind of the attraction, is that they're misunderstood. You know, they're like responsible for, you know, loads of pollination and seed dispersal. They control all the insects at night. You know, they've got so many things that we're, you know, we should be really thankful for, and yet we tend to not like them. But actually, loads of people like bats. Loads of people do, and loads of people are fascinated by them. So I think I'm going to dispute your claim that people don't like bats.
The thing is, I've only ever been afraid of a bat once in my life. I was in the Yucatan, and I was on my own, and I just stopped. I was staying in this hotel, and I decided to go for a walk at night into the woods. And I walked, and I was in shot of the, well, should I say, there was still a street light near me so I can see, and there was this kind of big bat that was kind of flying in ever decreasing circles around me. And I was thinking, And then I suddenly realized that, you know, I thought that vampire bats were tiny, but then I suddenly thought, hang on, some vampire bats are quite big. And I thought, you know what, time to vacate the woods. So I left, and I was a little bit scared.
It's probably a bat that ate fruit or insects. It's probably insects around your head, and it was circling around your head.
No, it was low down. It was actually around my sort of waist, which I was afraid of. But anyway, moving on. More seriously, actually, how have...
Claire in the chat is saying that she loves bats.
Yeah, listen, I love bats too. I'm just playing devil's advocate. Sorry. Anyway, the question I wanted to ask you was, in terms of lockdown, how have bats fared? Because you would imagine that the lack of human activity, or not as much human activity, it might have been a bit darker for them to carry on and find food and stuff.
I think bat populations have fared fine, as with everything else, but I think bats' press hasn't fared very well, because bats have been associated with this virus, which in ways which I'll explain in a bit. But that's meant that you know, a lot of people have been scapegoating particular species, and I guess, you know, it's easy to kind of target a particular species for, or particular person for this happening, this virus outbreak happening. But I guess it's, you know, it requires you to think more carefully about why this has happened. And, you know, it's more about our destruction of nature rather than any particular species. So they have not fared very well in terms of the press that they've been getting, but I've been really encouraged by how many people have come out of the woodwork to support bats and to, you know, defend them on Twitter and social media, and you know, a huge number of articles that people have chipped into to say, you know, don't blame them. It's more about our activities and how we're treating the natural world. So I've been actually quite encouraged by everybody's passion and wanting to change people's perceptions, and maybe this is a good time to do that.
Okay, well, this is also a good time to maybe learn more about what we'd like to speak about tonight. Yeah, it's a good segue. For those watching, if you want to see it better, I think it's best if you get out gallery view and go to speaker view, and then you'll be able to see the actual presentation as a whole screen as opposed to a tiny portion in the corner somewhere. So, Kate, over to you.
All right, hold on. All right, can you see that? Yeah.
And if you can't see it, people, let us know by putting your hand up or putting them. I think if you just signal, there's some sort of signal inside the participants bit where you can actually put a tick or a cross. So hopefully you can all see this.
So this is the title of my one paragraph book that I've started to write, which is called How Bats Have Changed the World. So I'm going to give you a bit of a preview of this book.
I hope that your paragraph wasn't half your paragraph wasn't that title.
Well, it took quite a lot of work to actually come up with that title. So that was a lot of the kind of, you know, that was like a few days of work thinking about that. So, all right. So I guess I wanted to kind of just give you a bit of a taster of the stuff that I've been working on over the past few years, and also to kind of make the links maybe that you've been hearing about wildlife and this coronavirus and why we're all here in lockdown. And I guess as we were talking about earlier, I've been fascinated by bats for over probably 30 years now. And I guess I'm going to try and talk to you and convince you about how this kind of fascination with bat ecology has acted as a kind of lens for me to understand how the health of our planet is intimately connected to our health and well-being. So bat ecology, I've kind of, you know, from years of working on it, it's kind of given me this insight into how ecology is linked to human health and well-being. And I've got a particular interest in these infectious diseases and understanding how to forecast them and predict them. And this is, you know, particular relevance now because, you know, in the current pandemic. So, okay, so the next slide somehow. So I said before that I kind of got, you know, I fell in love with bats. I was fascinated by bats when I was an undergrad at Leeds University studying zoology. But I properly caught the bat bug when I went on an expedition to Puerto Rico in 1999. And we were trying to understand the impacts of the massive hurricane that comes straight through Puerto Rico and understand the impacts on biodiversity on the island. And this is actually one of my cartoons. I'm a rubbish cartoonist, by the way, but this is just one of my cartoons of the trip and the team that I went with. And we were outside this cave, this hot cave, because it's a volcanic, not volcanic, it's like a hot cave that's got, you know, it's been fed by magma underneath the crust, but the water is being heating up, and it's like an amazing place for for wildlife. And we're outside this cave, and it's got millions and millions of bats in it, and it's called the boa cave, and it's got boa constrictors hanging off the ceiling, and they're fishing for bats as the bats come out. So we're just looking at the bats and figuring out how many there are and putting them, measuring them, letting them go again. So don't worry. So not only had I caught the bat bug but this, you know, exciting trip to Puerto Rico, but I'd also caught an actual bug. So I didn't know at the time, but I'd actually picked up a zoonotic pathogen, like a pathogen from animals. And this is the thing I picked up, and it's called Histoplasma capsulatum. So it's called histoplasmosis, the disease. And it's really quite common in bat caves and in bird lofts. And I picked it up when I was on this expedition. And of course, we weren't wearing any protective equipment at all. So it was incredibly stupid of me. But this disease, you know, if you're unlucky, you die. But fortunately, I was fine. But I've got scars on my lungs like this at the bottom. So I'm, you know, according to the doctors at the Royal Free Hospital in London, I'm of medical interest, but not of concern. So bats changed my world, you know, in many ways, but they definitely changed my world that day. And I can't actually leave the house now because I've got nodules on my lungs. So they also, not only did they change my world, but they've changed yours as well. And so this is, you know, a slide from May, and of course the number of COVID deaths are much higher now. So we don't have direct evidence as yet, but we strongly suspect that the ultimate source of the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 is also from a bat. And studies have shown that the coronavirus itself is about 96 to 98% similar genetically to coronaviruses found in bats. And that bats have a hugely long history with coronaviruses. There's lots of diversity in bats of coronaviruses. And at the moment, the closest similar virus to coronavirus is from this bat, this horseshoe bat. They've got amazing funny noses that they use to focus their beam of echolocation. So it's called a horseshoe bat. But this is probably, what we think is the closest source at the moment. So these are Chinese horseshoe bats. So, you know, and there's some other information about pangolins and other species that might have been involved in this transmission. So we're not really sure yet, but it probably, its ultimate source is probably one of these animals. So as we try and make sense of this crazy world that we seem to be in now, and this massive shift in our lives, it's really easy to demonize particular wildlife species, as I was saying before, and blaming them. And it seems like a really easy option to do that. And, you know, in some ways, bats are a really easy target. So there are huge myths that surround them. You know, they're dark, they're mysterious, they're dirty, they suck blood. So, you know, they're evil, they get in your hair, right? That's wrong. They're, you know, really amazing animals. And, you know, the underlying cause of this disease spillover is really rooted in our destruction of nature and overexploitation of wild species and wild places. But, you know, importantly, we can, and this is what I've been doing in my work, we can really try and use that understanding of how we're interacting with wild places and wild spaces to make predictive models of what we think might happen next, and more importantly, what to do to stop the next pandemic. So I'm just going to briefly shoot through some of the things that we've been doing to try to understand how to predict the next zoonotic spillover and a next pandemic. So firstly, in order to kind of understand how diseases are transmitted and the causes of how these things happen, you've got to kind of visualize the how transmission happens. So a lot of and understand the pathways of these. So majority of infectious diseases of humans are from animals. So about 2/3 to 3/4 of all human infectious diseases are from animals. And the kind of routes of transmission are really different and really varied. And so the simplest kind of things is that you get a direct contamination from blood of an animal into you. So that could be from exchanging bodily fluids or contamination of food. So that's kind of direct transmission, direct routes. There's also loads of other things that you can have vectors that are transmitting from, say, another wild species or domestic species into humans. So you can have viruses or pathogens transmitting from them. You can also have just it being a vector-borne disease like malaria. So the pathogen lives in the mosquito and then infects you. So that can be like sustained transmission of the pathogen from vectors into you. So we think that the number of emerging infectious diseases has increased over the last few decades. So I think we're getting more of these zoonotic pathogens, these ones from animals, than we ever have before. And it's trying to figure out why that's happening. And this is a really cool paper that my colleagues did about 20 years ago now to try to understand what the kind of links were between wildlife, human, and domestic species. And this slide is trying to show you that we all share pathogens with we all have pathogens, and every single species on the planet has pathogens, and it's about what changes those transmission dynamics between people, wildlife, and domestic species. And so things like moving wildlife about or moving domestic species about, a translocation. It's also about chopping down rainforests and human encroachment into different areas. It's about agricultural intensification. So it's changing those transmission dynamics between animals, domestic species, and humans. And also it's made worse by humans moving about the planet. So if you do have a spillover, then you're more likely for it to become a big problem because we're all so interconnected. So, this kind of study for the first time kind of showed that human activities are creating these spillover conditions between animals and people as we disrupt ecosystems. And just to give you, just to outline the kind of scale that we're destroying ecosystems and changing them, this kind of slide just shows you some examples, the growth of the human population or the numbers of humans, and then our annual growth rate. So our annual growth rate is actually coming down. So you can see this red line here is actually coming down, but because we've got so much growth in the system, we're still increasing our human population, and that changes the landscape that we're in. For example, road density is massively increasing, as is light pollution. So we're changing the habitats that we're in, and habitat loss and habitat change is the biggest threat to a number of different species. So changing the landscape is really altering these natural ecosystems, and it's that alteration that then starts to disrupt these transmission pathways, which therefore means that we're more likely to get these new emerging infectious diseases. So this is just a graph of a map of some of the work I did number of years ago, where I tried to show, like, I tried to really pin down what the actual role of biodiversity was. So are more areas which are more wild, are they more or less likely to give you an infectious disease? So this paper and others have been trying to debate this a lot about what's the role of biodiversity. Does it mean you have more infectious disease when you go into it, or do you have less of a chance of going in? So this paper was just showing that areas which have got a huge diversity of species, but also high human density, are areas which are at particular risk of having an emerging infectious diseases. So I looked at all the emerging infectious diseases that had happened since 1940, and then come up with a kind of likelihood surface, so a risk map, hotspots for where we think these things might happen in the future. So that would suggest that wildlife areas of high biodiversity would be a problem. But then lots and lots of other studies have shown that it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not just about areas of high biodiversity, but it's about what happens to ecosystems when you disrupt them. So this is an example from a disease called Lyme disease. I don't know whether any of you have heard about it, but it's transmitted by these black-legged ticks, and normally you have a kind of intact system. So forest, for example, you have a range of different species, so high biodiversity, like just normal biodiversity, natural ecosystem, and you've got a range of species in that forest, and some are worse, some are better than others at transmitting and eating ticks, so stopping the transmission of the virus. So these opossums, which are found in undisturbed habitats, are really great at grooming off ticks and eating them and stopping transmission. But these white-footed mice, which are found in more disturbed landscapes, are really rubbish at doing that. And actually it means that when you've got a disturbed landscape, the ecosystems start to unravel. And it means that the species which are present are more likely to give you to be hosting pathogens, or to live fast, die young, invest less in immunity. And therefore, we're kind of creating these very strange, unhealthy landscapes when we are disrupting the natural ecosystems which are present. So, so I'll just try to conceptualize it like this. And I'm just thinking about an urban area here. We're kind of filtering out some of these protective species which kind of dilute the kind of the ecological hazard that we're exposing ourselves to. So we have lots of species that just can't cope with human increases in pressure, like urban areas, for example, and some species really, really love it. So we're kind of filtering our habitats and environments by these different species, which, you know, maybe creating more hazard for ourselves. We're creating these very unhealthy landscapes. So, okay, that's all very well, but how do we then use that to make a predictive model to help policymakers to think about where the next emerging infectious disease is coming from? And I just want to close with an example from a really fascinating disease that I've been working on for the past few years, and that's Ebola. We had an outbreak. I started working on this when we were working in Sierra Leone in 2013, and my team was caught in the outbreak, the Ebola outbreak, around 2014, and many of my team stayed to help with the outbreak because they got lots of skills that could help local hospitals and stuff with diagnosing and sequencing the virus. But we got caught up in this, and we decided to have a look to see whether we could use our data and our approach about understanding how ecological systems are disassembled, and how could we use that to make a predictive model of where Ebola might be. So this has got a tiny bit of maths in it, but I'm just going to go through it. Okay. So we decided to think about it in different stages. So we cut up all of the planet into these 1 kilometre grid squares. And for each kilometre grid square, we had a model running in it. So the model is called a compartmental model. Bear with me. You understand this, right? So a compartmental model means you've got humans at different stages. So susceptible means that you're just normal, just going about your daily business. And then you're exposed to a virus, so you move into this next compartment. And then if you catch this disease, you're exposed to it, you're then infectious. So you're shedding virus to other people. And then Ebola is such a horrendous disease that you're still infectious 2 days after you're dead. So we have a funeral compartment here. So you move into a funeral compartment if you're dead. And then you either, then you're just removed from the system. So that goes out of the system. So we modeled how the virus would move between human populations within these little grid squares across Africa, or the world actually, but I'm just showing you Africa here. And then we thought about, okay, so that's the human bit. And then we thought about the hazard, the ecological hazard. So what are the hosts for this virus? And then, so we have a susceptible and exposed category here. And then we can use our knowledge of where these species are and our suitability of the landscape across Africa to understand what the likelihood was of these hosts being there. So they're actually bats, these fruit bats, which carry Ebola. And then the kind of behavior of people, how likely are they to become infected by this? So this is from first principles, really. So we built all of this out from our knowledge. And then we ran the whole thing so across the servers at UCL and broke them a bit, but we ran it all thousands and thousands of times. And you can have the kind of starting conditions, which is up here on the right, and then change your environment, change that you may have a vaccine so you can stop the exposed people being infected, or you have different cultural practices so that you don't have so many funerals. So you can have a starting condition and then change it to understand how policy might be impacting the spread of this disease. And also we put in real roads and waterways for people to go on so that you can move from grid to grid across this whole landscape. So this means that you can do it from first principles about what you know about the ecology and how that responds to environmental change, but also what we know about how the pathogen goes from human to human. So we ran the whole thing. So this is this is the kind of map that you get produced. So this is from first principles, right? So we don't have any real data about what has actually happened in the past to inform this model, and it shows you the most likely areas in yellow and the least likely areas in grey. So we've got a kind of map here on the left, which is showing you where we think the biggest risk of an outbreak and then an outbreak becoming more serious would be across sub-Saharan Africa. And then I've just put on the white crosses are where we know where the outbreaks have happened. So it's a pretty good fit to what we know. And this is not having any of those data in, it's just our understanding of the ecology and how the environment's changing, our interaction with animals, and then people moving about. And so this one on the right hand side here is just the spillovers, the first time that might happen. And then this one at the far right is really horrible. I'm laughing, it's not really laughing, but it's one that if an outbreak happened, these populations of humans are so kind of, they're really susceptible, or they don't have enough healthcare in that particular village or town, that these outbreaks would be much more serious. So we did this modelling in about 2017, 2018, and this was before this happened in DRC. So this is one of the big outbreaks of Ebola that has happened, and we've successfully predicted that. So these are our kind of our risk parts where we predicted that this would happen, and these are the actual places of the outbreak. So these are places which populations are really susceptible and vulnerable to disease outbreaks like this. So I guess the kind of, just to end then, we've been trying to think about how to use our knowledge of these systems to make predictive models for combating these diseases and stopping the spread. So another, you know, I've mentioned bats before, and I just want to kind of end with just some things about bats, which I think mean that they are really fascinating and special, but they also could hold the key to dealing with a lot of these viruses. So a lot of people think that bats host loads and loads of pathogens, and actually, if you look at how many species there are over 1,400. They do host a lot of pathogens, but every single species on the planet hosts lots of different diseases, and they just host as many as you would expect from how many there actually are. So in proportion to how many they are, they're not special. They're just about the same as rodents and other species. So they're not special in terms of the numbers that they hold, but there's something really cool about bats, which may mean that they are, it'd be really cool to understand them a lot more for us to understand how to deal with viruses. And that is that in their evolution of flight, they've had to evolve lots of mechanisms to deal with a lot of metabolic stress and damage. So when they produce lots and lots of energy, there's lots of oxidative damage that damages DNA, and they have evolved immune systems to respond to that and repair DNA. And they're very, very good at dealing with intracellular pathogens because of this, because they've got these mechanisms which can repair DNA really quickly, and that's the type of damage that viruses do. So they are very susceptible to other pathogens. So a fungal pathogen in the United States is causing mass devastation of different populations of bats. But for intracellular pathogens like viruses, they may hold the key to how we deal with these. So they have these crazy immune systems, which means that they can respond really, really quickly. So it also might mean that viruses which are adapted to bats might be, you know, very good at evading the immune system being on all the time, and actually everything else that isn't a bat might have a problem when they're dealing with them. So there's lots and lots of lessons to learn here, and bats have very little rates of cancer because they can repair DNA, and they live extraordinarily long time. So a bat which is, say, you know, 16 grams or so can live up to 40 years, which is extraordinarily long. Okay, so bats are, you know, as I touched on before, they're incredibly important for our planet and pollinate more than 500 species of plants and insect regulators. So they're really incredibly important things they're key to our, you know, survival on this planet and survival of ecosystems. So it's not right to demonize them at all. It's like they're very critical to life on this planet and could actually help us understand how to deal with viruses. But we need to get much better at understanding how we're destroying environments and changing ecosystems, and what that means for our risk. Okay, so my conclusions then. Bats are awesome. Key drivers of disease spillovers are human actions and changing transmission dynamics between species and humans, and changing the probability of things spilling over into humans. And we need to have much more ecological thinking when we talk about human health and well-being. And I'm just going to end on a quote from Richard Horton. And I don't know whether you know who Richard Horton is, but he's the editor of The Lancet, and The Lancet is the biggest medical journal on the planet. And he said, he's not a fluffy bunny ecologist or conservationist. He's a hard-nosed, internationally renowned, global developmental person who makes international decisions about the planet. He said this in 2017: if we're concerned about human health, we should also be concerned about the health of the biosphere that we inhabit. It's rare to hear health advocates talk about biodiversity. Health and climate change is now fixed into the lexicon of global and public health, but biodiversity remains largely invisible. It's time to make protecting the biodiversity of our planet the next great cause of planetary health. Thanks very much.
That was Incredible. I mean, I've got a million questions for you. I mean, I just, it's so obvious what we need to do. We need to protect the biodiversity. We can't be going in trashing forests and thinking to ourselves, oh, that species has gone extinct. Who cares? I never saw it anyway. It's no big deal. People don't realize just how interwoven everything is. And we are just taking bits of this jigsaw away and expecting it all to stand up. And obviously all this stuff's happening. It's just, I'm sure there's lots of questions from the Zoomers actually, because I've been talking all night. I've got a ton of questions to ask you actually. The first question I want to ask you actually, whilst everyone's gathering themselves, and thank you by the way for that great presentation. Do you think that the kind of apathy shown, if that's one word I can use really, by people in some of the Western developed countries like Britain, like in America, to coronavirus, in that it's a hoax, it's not, this is not a big deal, how many people die of flu, probably a load more. Do you think that if this was actually Ebola, would people have the same attitude?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think with Ebola, the effects are really severe. And so, you have a case fatality rate of, say, 60 to 100%. So all people that get it, the majority of people that get Ebola die, basically. That's what it means. So I think the effects are more apparent than this virus, which is, very sneaky and has a really big range of outcomes. So, possibly if it was more apparent what the virus was doing, you might have more compliance with the lockdown and things like that. But I guess the other thing to think about Ebola is that it doesn't travel very far. It can't travel very far because it requires close contact with people, and so it's much easier to control than this one. So this one is like the worst nightmare because people are, transmitting it and not having any symptoms, and that's really, really difficult to control.
Yeah, because I was thinking about this particular pandemic, and then I did some research myself on the Spanish flu. And by the way, Spanish flu is a misnomer because it's only called the Spanish flu because when it was prevalent in the world, what, in 1918 or something around that time, I can't remember when it was.
First World War it was.
Yeah, First World War, yeah. Everyone else, all the other countries involved in the war kept quiet about it because they wanted to keep morale up. And because Spain was neutral, the media in Spain spoke freely about it, and that's how it got its name, Spanish flu, because it wasn't actually Spain in that respect.
People think it might have originated in America.
America, yeah, exactly, yeah, because it's brought over by soldiers. But if, I was really frightened thinking that, if this was Spanish flu, I mean, that killed between 30 to 50 million people in 2 years. Surely people would be behaving in a much different way now. People in America would not be sort of saying, I don't care, I'm going to work or whatever. It would be a lot different, this world, do you not think?
Well, you have to find a factor in the kind of mistrust that's grown up around science and scientists in the States. And there's a whole political thing there going on about climate change and Republicans and Democrats, and it's so partisan. It's really difficult to know how much of it is really political rather than, and this mistrust of science rather than just being about the virus. So I think it's a really complicated situation in the States, I think, at the moment.
And in terms of the COVID-19, is it correct to call that a virus? Is it a virus? Or is it coronavirus, the virus? I'm a bit ignorant, I'm sorry.
COVID-19 is the disease, and then the virus is called SARS-2, I think, SARS-CoV-2.
Okay, well, basically, given the fact that's out there now, two questions really. Firstly, has there been a backlash against bats? Have people, for example, in China gone out and tried to kill loads of bats? And secondly, is there a danger? I mean, for example, with Spanish flu, and I know flu is different to this, and that's the other thing. I want to know what the difference is actually. But I know it's different. But is there a danger that in the future there could be another strain, another version of this thing that's more virulent, Because I've been watching the news. You know, again, you don't know what to kind of take in, but now they're saying it leaves scars not only in your lungs but in your brain as well, and all that sort of stuff. It's actually pretty scary. It's like a ghost. It's like a spectre, a shadow that comes over us, and we kind of think we're going to be fine, and maybe not. So do you think it's going to get worse? I mean, it's two completely different questions. Do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better? And is there going to be like a revenge on the bats?
So I think we have very short memories as a human population. So AIDS, which happened in the 80s, caused more people to die. Like millions of people died from AIDS, which is also a zoonotic disease. So that happened. Like SARS happened, MERS happened, Zika happened. You know, these things happen regularly and increasingly so. And so, you know, will something like this happen again? Inevitably. When is it going to happen? I don't know. But, you know, this is a part of our life. It has been ever since the Black Death. You know, like this is what happens to human populations, and we somehow forget that this is part of our existence. So it will happen again. Has there been a backlash against bats? Yes, but I haven't seen much evidence of people killing them. I think a lot of people have come out very passionately for bats and I've really tried to get to the root causes of why this is happening. Not because of bats or rats or birds or whatever. It's not because of that. Everything has its own set of pathogens. Everything on the planet, like a slug. You know, it's just about how we interact with those things. That's really important to understand. So I think it's much more about our actions. That's to blame for what's happened. You know, it's not about any particular species or group of species.
Yeah, Karima has a question. Is it possible for you, Karima, to actually show your lovely face and ask the question yourself?
Yeah, sorry, I think it's quite bad, but
Still on the puppy.
A puppy.
Sorry, let me just get my question. I didn't know where I wrote it in the chat. I'm just thank you for the talk, by the way. It's really interesting. I'm just wondering, on the slide showing zoonotic diseases amongst the different animal groups, I think I saw that passerines carry quite a high proportion. And I was just wondering, has that been researched at all? Maybe more so with migratory species transmitting zoonotic diseases?
Yeah, that's a really big concern, to be honest, and that's the source of H1N1 flu. It's like it's bird flu, right? So that some of the movements of people in different regions for working has brought people into contact with lots of different of bird species and migrating bird species, and they can also then transmit that into, you know, domestic poultry populations. So there's a really delicate balance between human movement, humans going into areas to work on new roads, for example, new train lines, and then, you know, then picking that up from birds, or it could be amplified in domestic populations of chickens and ducks and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of interest in that. Like West Nile is probably the same. So that, like the flu pandemics are probably, you know, they're zoonotic, but then they recombine with each other over generations. So that's the biggest risk, really, and the biggest effort that's gone in as a planet, as a society, global society, has been to prepare for global flu pandemics. So zoonotic pandemics are quite rare, just because the majority, like, you know, most of the zoonotic pathogens are just, they can't get in us at all. You know, they just can't get through any of the defenses. And then some of them that can get in and cause a problem can't pass on, because that's another range of things that you have to evolve. Like rabies, for example, can't get anywhere else. You know, you don't get this is not rabies to rabies transmission. Oh my God, can you imagine? So, you know, that doesn't happen. And Ebola is, you know, the ones which can, like Ebola, you know, you've heard of them, you know, they're so rare that you probably know all their names, you know, like AIDS, Ebola, you know, that they're something that's very rare. So it's very rare for it to happen, but it's devastating when it does, because these are new pathogens that we don't know anything about. And that's the problem with this disease, is that we don't really understand it enough to know what it's attacking.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karima. We got a question from Michelle, but you know what, Michelle, is it possible for you to ask that question in our sort of bit after this? Because we've come to an hour in our program tonight. If that's okay, Michelle, if you just hang on for another few minutes. I need to just lighten up for a second and ask you, Kate, 2 questions.
Oh, yeah.
What is your favourite mammal? Think about it carefully.
Okay, yeah. I think that it's really hard for me, because it's going to be a bat, but like which one? So I think I'm going to have to go for the Honduras white bat, because
I had a feeling you'd go for that, because was that the white bat in the corner of one of your images? Because it looks quite interesting.
So it's got like a yellow nose, and it's like a little white ball of fluff, and they form like these family groups, and they modify a banana leaf into a tent. Very cute. I've got some juggling balls actually, like, of them. It's awesome.
Maybe in the after show party you can juggle some balls for us and show us how it all works. If you could be anywhere, notwithstanding this current pandemic, where would you be on the planet?
Before lockdown, I was in Australia, in Brisbane, and we went to Stradbroke Island, Straddy, and they have the 2nd largest sandbar in the entire world. And we walked for miles and miles and miles on this beautiful white sandy beach with a beautiful sun and sea. Oh, there's lots of probably sharks in the sea, but you know, beautiful. And I'd really like to be there with some kind of margarita.
Sounds good. Just to let everyone know, coming up, we've got quite a few people coming up, but confirmed so far, we've got Sasha Dench next Wednesday, and she's talking about the flight of the osprey. She's going to be flying with migrating ospreys from Scotland to Gambia. And Sasha is a very famous lady. She won the Woman of the Year in 2017, I think it was. And also she's worked for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, and she's related to Judi Dench as well. A bit like you really, in terms of your relation to a famous person. On Thursday, the 9th of July, we've got Chris Wood, who is one of the head honchos at eBird, and he'll be telling us how eBird works. And for those who don't know, it's an app that sort of, you can plug in all the birds you've been watching anywhere in the world, and it kind of collates it in a global sense. Next Friday, we're happy to have Gillian Burke, who is a lady presenter on Springwatch, and she'll be talking about being a woman in natural history, which should be interesting. And then on Monday, the 27th of July, we've got a guy called Doug Tallamy. You may not have heard of him. He's an American guy, but he's written a book, which is basically a vision for the grassroots, or for a grassroots approach to conservation. So it'd be interesting to hear what he has to say. So that's what's coming up. There's loads more. Check out the website, and you know, there's going to be more people coming up between now and the end of July. And I think between August and maybe October, we'll have a little break, and we'll come back fighting fit again. So that's the deal for the next few weeks. Kate, thank you very much for sparing your time. It's, you know, I was so happy to have got you here in the room. But thank you very much for coming today.
Pleasure.
And Zoomers, thank you once again for supporting In Conservation With, which is sponsored by Leica. I feel like I'm American now, you know, in terms of sponsored by Leica Nature and Birding, as well as King's Place Music Foundation, and their Nature Unwrapped season. So take care of yourselves, look after yourselves and your families and everyone else, and don't forget to keep looking up for those bats